Welcome to this lesson on the image list control. After completing this lesson, you will have learned to store images in an image list control, to display images stored in an image list control, and also the purpose of the DoEvents method. Now let's explore the image list control. Image list control is somewhat similar to our ListBox control in that it hosts a collection, but in the case of the image list control, the collection is a collection of images or bitmaps as opposed to other objects. So the other thing that's interesting about the image list control, and you see I have one here on the deck, and I've named that one iWalker. But so you can see what happens when you add image list control. Let's go ahead and add another one. When I drag that out onto the form, you would ordinarily expect to see that control represented on the form. And instead, it's down here on the deck. And what is interesting about that, or what that implies, is that the image list control does not have a visual interface on it at all. It really is a logical piece. In order to manifest the images, we use another control such as a PictureBox, and then we populate the PictureBox out of the collection of the image list control. So I'm going to go ahead and delete image list 1 since we don't need that. Let's see, sorry about that job that just popped up. Let's see if we can make that go away. All right, so here I have our basic interface. So I have a picture box, I have a button. I put a label out here to give homage and credit to the source of the walking sequence that I'm using for my images. Now, we can use the images, they can be totally unrelated anytime you need a whole set of images. So for instance, we could have an image of a deck of cards. I've chosen to have a little fun with this, and I have a sequence of animations of a basic figure that is walking, and so sort of stop frame animation. Each frame shows a different intermediate progression in this character walking, and so I got that from Sira.com, and you can find similar walking sequences out there. And what I thought it would be fun to do is to have the animate button run a bit of code that will change the image one after the other in the sequence so that it appears to make our character walk on the screen. Okay, so let's take a look at some of the things I've done to populate that. So the first thing I did was downloaded from Sira.com a group of 8 images that have the walking sequence, and I've stored those in a convenient location on my system. And then I went into the images collection. So remember, the list box has an items collection. The image list has an images collection. And if we take a look, oops, I'm still looking at the image list one. Let's take a look at for iWalker. There we go. So this is our image list iWalker. And in its collection, what I have placed in that is I've added each of those PNG graphic files in order. And notice that they each have an index, very much like a list box. Although the list box, it's inferred. It's not numbered here on the side for you. And so this shows the index numbers 0 through 7. So there are 8 of them. Note that it starts counting at 0. And I've set those at a ratio that is proportionate to the original proportions of the drawing. I think the original were 200 to 300. I've made mine 168 to 252. I thought that was a nice size here for the image on our program. And so we've got those images in sequence 0 through 7 in our collection. Great. Now, once those are in our collection, I've dropped a picture box, which I've named PB animation, PictureBox animation, and we need to write some code triggered by the click event on the button I've called animate. So on the animate button, in order to show each of those pictures in turn. And from our previous tutorials on refresh and sleep, you know that we're going to need to, after each image is shown, we need to call the refresh event so that the interface is forced to redraw, because it will defer that in preference of running other code, and we want to make sure that we force that so that the user has a chance to see the image, see that it's rendered. And the other thing we're going to do is call the thread sleep event for long enough for your eye to process the image when it is rendered, but not so long that the flow of images doesn't give us the impression of continuous motion as it shifts from one image to the next with a slight movement of the body and the legs and the arms and so forth. Okay, so let's take a look at how the logic should work in the animate button. So let's go ahead and build that. So first, what let's do is let's declare the a variable, an integer variable. We'll call it num images, and we'll make that equal to the number of images. So there's 0 through 7, so there are 8 of them is the count. And doing it this way rather than hard coding it to count, if we add additional images to our sequence, our animation sequence, or we use this reuse this code, it will build that off of whatever the number of images are that are stored in the images collection of the image list box that we're using. Okay, and then the basic thing we need to do is for each of those images, we need to show the animation. Okay, so we could do that this way. So for index 0 to num images minus 1, so there are 8, so that'll take us to 7, because remember we started counting at 0, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Counting 0, that's 8 images, so we want to reduce that by 1. Otherwise, we try and get the image 8 index. There isn't one. There's 0 through 7. And then let's take the image on the picture box and set it equal to the image in whatever the current index is. So as our loop iterates from 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, it'll show us image 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And then we need to put in the refresh event to make sure that that form is redrawn to show the image. And then we're going to let the image sleep for a little while. And let's hold off on this DoEvents loop for a couple minutes, and let's just, we'll come back and discuss that. Let's see what our animation, what our program does so far. All right, and let's click animate, and it walks through the walk sequence. Good, and that timing's pretty good. You can experiment with the timing to get, depending on the amount of change in each image and the what we're going to be creating here is basically an animation frame rate. You can play around with that. So we could start at half a second per frame, but you'll find that that's pretty slow and unnatural and herky-jerky. Your eye doesn't necessarily see that as continuous motion. And so we could drop that down to 250. A little better, but still kind of unnatural. And I found that for this particular group of images and the amount of change there is in each one, about an eighth of a millisecond, 125 milliseconds is, so an eighth of a second is about right. So about 8 frames per second when it comes out to it. Good, and so that looks pretty natural. Okay, so we've run through that, and clicking the button runs the sequence once, but what we'd really like to do is run that sequence continuously until we tell the system to halt. So let's go ahead and do a little more work here. And wouldn't it be nice if we could make this same button change from animate to halt, so we don't have to have a separate button, which means that there'll be code in a different control, and so we'd have to deal with how we communicate between those two controls. Maybe we can do it all in this one control. Okay, so let's add some logic here, and that says if the button animate text currently says animate, then let's change the text to halt. And otherwise, if it's anything else, change it back to animate. So this is going to change the button between animate and halt. And that's interesting, but so far that doesn't change how often this will run. Let's just see what that much does. Okay, animate turns to halt, but I can't really do anything with it. And it's just toggling back and forth and not really quite even doing what we'd like it to do at this point. It's just toggling from one state to the other. Okay, so what we really want to do is we want to have this sequence of 8 images displayed multiple times. Well, how often we would like to do it? Well, I'd like to have it start and then keep going forever until the user interrupts it by pressing that button again. So let's say while button animate text equals halt. So only if the button currently says halt, do the following. And let's move that that end while down here. Okay. And so in theory, what's happening is it's going to, if the button said animate, it's going to start the sequence. Otherwise, it's just going to change the button back to animate. And so if it is already animated, it'll start the sequence and change the button text to halt. And then let's see if that's working as we expect. So animate, and it's running, and it's running, and it's running continuously, but I have a problem. It's in that button event. It's running and sleeping and refreshing and running and sleeping and refreshing. So it never comes out to see that I'm pushing this button again. Okay, so it isn't stopping to read the event queue to find out that the button has been pressed another time. And so that's kind of problematic. Gosh, are we going to be able to do this after all? Well, it turns out, let's go ahead and use the debugger to end the run. There is another handy thing called the DoEvents method. And DoEvents is sort of like sleep in that it interrupts the current thread. But what it's going to do is it's going to go out and read the message queue and say, hey, if I have things that have been queued up for Windows to do, I'm going to go ahead and process those events, including the portion of the run loop that's going to be allowing controls to be interacted with and clicked and moved and mouse moves and all those other things that are going on. And it will then process that button click. And this is pretty cool because we're already in the event code for that button click. The DoEvents lets you push that button again, and it runs this code again from the start, at which point it says, oh, it's currently in the animate. I'll change it to halt. And by the way, that is our exit condition for our loop. So the loop, next time it comes to the next statement, will find that the button no longer says halt, therefore it will exit. All right, so with the application DoEvents now being processed, let's see how this works. And we push animate, and as before, but now notice that our halt button is live, and we can stop it because we are pausing to process any events that have queued for this application, and the only event in this case that's queued is that the button click was executed. And of course, our code then says, oh, I'll look and see. And I see that our button does not say animate, it says halt. And so I'll change it back to animate. Okay. And this loop, the next time it executes, we'll see that the button no longer says halt, it says animate, which means that halt has been initiated. So it then exits the loop and the animation ends. Pretty clever, eh? All right, so just to recap, we have the image list box, which itself, strangely enough, although it's named image list box, does not have a visual representation in the control. We use another control that can display the image, such as the PictureBox control, in order to make the image manifest. And we are working with a control that is similar to the list box in that it has a collection, but in this case, instead of a collection of objects, it's a collection of images. And then we can also explore other attributes of the images, such as the image size and the color depth of the image and so forth. And then we are controlling that. In this case, we've chosen, just for fun, to make this a animation sequence that we're running through. That's not the only use, again, of the image list box. If we had a whole bunch of unrelated pictures and we need to show one or another, so let's say you're saying pick a card, any card, we could put 52 images of a deck of cards in there and have you generate a random number between, let's say it's a 52 card deck, so between 1 and 52, or in this case 0 and 51, and then we would show that image, and it would be sort of not a random number generator, but in this case a random playing card generator. All right, I think that will do it for now. This concludes the lesson.